The house smelled like my dad. 2 years after we buried him in Millbrook Cemetery outside of Nashville, I could still walk through that front door on Sycamore Lane and catch it. Sawdust, Old Spice, and the faint ghost of black coffee that had been brewing in that kitchen since before I was born. My father, Daniel Calloway, was not a wealthy man. He didn't leave behind stock portfolios or beach houses or trust funds with my name engraved on them. He left me one thing: a house. And for a man like my dad, a man who built things with his hands, who refinished those hardwood floors himself over a long Labor Day weekend, who planted the oak tree in the backyard the year I was born, that house was the inheritance. It was every Christmas morning and every summer thunderstorm watched from the porch. It was the only address I had ever called home. My name is Riley Calloway. I was 22 when my father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was 24 when I discovered what my stepmother had done while I wasn't looking. Her name was Diane. She had been in my father's life for 6 years. Smooth, strategic, and surgically charming. The kind of woman who brought casseroles to church potlucks and remembered everyone's birthday and made you feel vaguely guilty for not trusting her more. My dad loved her. I think he genuinely did. And maybe that's the part that still hurts the most. Not just what she did, but that she did it wearing his trust like a costume. When Dad died, he left behind a will. Simple, clear, notarized. The house on Sycamore Lane went to me. Diane got his truck, his savings account, modest but real, and the right to remain in the house for 90 days while she got herself sorted. 90 days. I was finishing my nursing degree in Memphis. I was grieving. I was barely sleeping. I told myself she deserved those 90 days. I told myself I was being generous, mature, the kind of daughter my dad would have been proud of. I gave her 90 days. She used every single one of them. I drove back to Millbrook on a Saturday in late spring with a U-Haul trailer and a plan to finally move into my house. Start fresh. Feel close to my dad again. Plant something in that backyard next to the oak tree he put there for me. I turned onto Sycamore Lane and slowed down. The oak tree was still there. But there was a for sale sign in the front yard, and a bright red sold sticker slapped across it like a wound. Pulled over. Put the truck in park. Sat there for a long moment with both hands on the steering wheel and the radio still playing some stupid pop song that I will never be able to hear again without feeling sick. Then I got out. I walked up to that sign and I read it. Then I read it again. Then I took a photo of it with my phone, not because I needed evidence yet, but because some part of me already knew that what came next was going to require documentation. Called Diane. She answered on the second ring. Riley, honey. Her voice was warm. Practice. The voice she used at church. I was actually going to call you this week. This week. Not yesterday. Not when she signed whatever papers she signed. Not when she handed over the keys to a house that belonged to me. This week. Whose name did you use? Yes. Quiet. Steady. He paused just half a second too long. We really should talk in person, sweetheart. Whose name, Diane? She hung up. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my father's house. My house, with a dead call on my phone and a sold sign in my face, and I made a decision right there on that ordinary Saturday morning. I was not going to cry. I was not going to fall apart. I was going to find out exactly what she did, exactly how she did it, and exactly who helped her do it. And then I was going to burn it all down, legally. My father's attorney was a man named Gerald Puckett. He operated out of a small office above a dry cleaner's on Main Street in Millbrook, the kind of office with wood-paneled walls and a Mr. Coffee machine and a framed photo of Ronald Reagan that had clearly been there since the 80s. Gerald was 64 years old, semi-retired, and had written my father's will himself on a Thursday afternoon 3 years before Dad died. When I walked into his office that Saturday, still in my moving clothes, U-Haul parked outside, hands steadier than they had any right to be, Gerald took one look at my face and said, "Sit down, Riley. What happened?" Told him. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look surprised exactly. More like a man watching a weather pattern he had been half expecting. When I finished, he unlocked his bottom desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "Your father's will is airtight," he said, spreading the documents on the desk. The property at 414 Sycamore Lane was transferred to you, Riley and Calloway, upon date of death. Diane had no legal ownership. None. Then how did she sell it? Gerald leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers together. That is the question, isn't it? What we uncovered over the next 72 hours was infuriating in its simplicity. Diane hadn't needed a forgery ring or a criminal mastermind. She had needed one thing: timing. In Tennessee, probate, the legal process of officially transferring inherited property, can take months. Sometimes longer, depending on court schedules and paperwork delays. During that window, the deed still technically showed my father's name. Diane, as his surviving spouse, had a legal foothold. Not ownership, but enough of an appearance of authority that a motivated person could exploit it. And Diane was nothing if not motivated. She had approached a local real estate agent named Todd Briggs, a guy more interested in his commission than in asking hard questions. She presented herself as the estate administrator. She had a death certificate, a letter on official-looking stationery, and the kind of confident church lady energy that made people assume she knew what she was doing. Todd didn't pull the will, didn't verify the inheritance, didn't call Gerald. He listed the house in 8 days and had a signed contract in 3 weeks. The buyers, a young couple from Chattanooga, had paid $287,000 for my house. My father's house. The house with the oak tree he planted the year I was born. She sold it for below market value, Gerald noted, running his finger down the numbers. Probably to move it fast. Can we get it back? Gerald was quiet in the way that lawyers get quiet when the answer requires more than a yes or no. The buyers are innocent third parties, he said carefully. That complicates a straight reversal. But Diane committed fraud. Misrepresentation to a real estate agent. Potentially wire fraud if any of this crossed state lines or involved electronic transfers, which it did. He paused. Riley, what she did is a crime. Crime. I let that word sit in the room. I thought about Diane's voice. I was actually going to call you this week, and something cold and focused settled in my chest. Not rage. Rage is loud and messy and gets you nowhere. This was something sharper. Quieter. This was purpose. What do I need to do? Yes. Gerald picked up his pen. First, we file a complaint with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission. Then we contact the DA's office. Then, he looked at me over his reading glasses, we call your Uncle Pete. And blinked. Why Uncle Pete? Because your Uncle Pete, Gerald said, allowing himself a small smile, is a real estate attorney in Nashville. And he has never liked Diane. Pulled out my phone. 14 missed calls from Diane glowed on the screen. I ignored every single one of them. I scrolled to Uncle Pete's number, pressed call and listened to it ring. Once, twice. While outside on Main Street, Millbrook went about it Saturday like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Diane had made the mistake of assuming I was still the quiet, grieving girl who needed 90 days to get her life together. She had no idea who I was becoming. Uncle Pete Calloway was not a warm man. He was brilliant, blunt, and had the kind of energy that made junior associates spill their coffee just walking past his office. He wore expensive suits to backyard barbecues, argued with football referees like it was billable hours, and had exactly zero patience for people who confused confidence with competence. He had tolerated Diane at family dinners. Barely. She always smiled too much, he told me once years ago at my cousin's graduation party. People who smile that much are keeping score. I had laughed it off then. I wasn't laughing now. When I called him that Saturday afternoon, Pete picked up on the first ring. I hadn't even finished explaining before he said, "Where are you right now?" "Millbrook. Gerald Puckett's office." Put him on speaker. What followed was 40 minutes of the most intense legal conversation I had ever witnessed, and I had sat through evidence review sessions in nursing school that felt like psychological warfare. Pete asked questions like a man dismantling a machine. He wanted dates, names, document numbers. He wanted to know exactly which title company had processed the sale, exactly which county clerk had recorded the transfer, and exactly how Todd Briggs had justified skipping a routine probate verification. Gerald answered everything calmly, referencing his notes. When they finished, Pete said, "This is fraud. Clear, documentable, prosecutable fraud." "That's what I told her," Gerald said. "Riley." Pete's voice shifted, still sharp, but something underneath it that might have been protective. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "I want to know what we do next." Then, "Good girl. Here's what happens now." Over the next week, Uncle Pete operated like a controlled explosion. He filed a title dispute with the county recorder's office in Millbrook. He contacted the Tennessee Real Estate Commission and submitted a formal complaint against Todd Briggs, including documentation showing he had failed to verify probate status before listing the property. He reached out to the buyer's attorney in Chattanooga, not aggressively but factually, explaining that the sale had been made under fraudulent misrepresentation and that litigation was likely incoming. The buyers, a couple named Marcus and Jenna Holloway, were blindsided. They had done nothing wrong. They had saved for years for that house. They had already started planning renovations. When their attorney called Pete back, the conversation was tense but professional. The Holloways didn't want a lawsuit. They wanted answers. "They're going to cooperate," Pete told me over the phone on Wednesday night. "They're furious at the seller," meaning Diane, not at you. "What about Diane?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "She's been served," Pete said simply. I sat with that for a moment. Somewhere across Millbrook, probably in the Marriott on Route 41 where she'd been staying since the house sold, Diane was holding a legal notice with her name on it, reading words like fraud and misrepresentation and civil liability. I wondered if she was still smiling. "Pete," I said, "is there criminal exposure here?" "I already had a conversation with someone at the DA's office," he said. "Unofficially. They're interested." I exhaled slowly. This was no longer just about getting the house back. This was about a woman who had looked at my father's death and seen opportunity. Who had watched me grieve and calculated the window. Who had smiled at his funeral and then spent 90 days quietly, methodically dismantling the only thing he had left me. She had gambled on my silence. She had bet that I was too heartbroken, too busy, too young, too female to come looking. She had been wrong on every count. Thursday morning, I drove past Sycamore Lane on my way to Gerald's office. The sold sign was still there. I stopped the car and looked at the oak tree in the backyard, visible over the fence, thick and green and completely indifferent to the chaos swirling around it. My dad had planted that tree 24 years ago. He had watered it with a garden hose every summer evening while I ran through the sprinkler in the yard. He had measured my height against its trunk every birthday until I was 12 and finally taller than the lowest branch. That tree wasn't going anywhere. Neither was I. 22 missed calls. That was the count by Friday morning. 22 calls from Diane spread across 6 days, each one going straight to voicemail because Pete had told me clearly, "Do not speak to her without counsel present. Anything you say becomes part of the record." Her voicemails started confident. "Riley, honey, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Call me back so we can clear this up like adults." Then they got softer. "I know you're upset. I understand that. But your father would have wanted us to handle this like family." Then they got desperate. "Riley, please. I made a mistake. I was grieving too. I wasn't thinking clearly. Can we just talk?" I listened to all of them exactly once, then forwarded each one to Pete's paralegal for the file. Every voicemail was evidence. Every word she chose. Misunderstanding, mistake, wasn't thinking clearly, was an admission dressed up in excuses. I had stopped being her stepdaughter the day I found that sold sign. Now I was a claimant, and she was a defendant. That Friday evening I was staying at my friend Cassie's apartment in Millbrook, a second-floor walk-up above a pizza place that smelled permanently of garlic bread, which under normal circumstances I would have loved. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal I wasn't eating, reviewing documents Pete had emailed, when Cassie appeared in the doorway. "Riley." Her voice was careful. "There's someone downstairs." I looked up. "She says she's your stepmother." Everything in me went still. Had two choices. Could go down. Could stay up. Pete had said, "No conversations without counsel." But Pete wasn't the one who had driven past Sycamore Lane 6 times in 6 days. Pete wasn't the one who had stood at his father's grave last Sunday and tried to explain, quietly, privately, feeling slightly insane, what was happening to the house on the hill. Closed my laptop. "Tell her I'll be down in 5 minutes, I said. Cassie looked at me like I'd announced I was jumping off a bridge. "Riley, I'm not going to say anything stupid," I said. "I just need her to see my face." Diane was standing on the sidewalk outside the building. She had dressed carefully. Neat blazer, pearl earrings, the whole church lady armor fully deployed. But something was off in her eyes. Tightness. A calculation running visibly underneath the performed calm. She looked older than I remembered. "But, Riley." She stepped forward. I stepped back. "You stop. Read the message." "I just want to explain," she began. "You're being recorded," I said. Which was a bluff. I hadn't thought to hit record until I was already downstairs. But her expression flickered, and I filed that reaction away. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. Her voice was steady but her hands weren't. The property transfer was delayed. The estate was complicated, I thought. "You thought what, Diane?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. Not angry. Just tired. That I wouldn't come back. That I'd be too sad to check. That I stopped. "Breathe. What exactly did you think?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. For the first time in 6 years, maybe for the first time ever, Diane had nothing ready. "My father built those porch steps himself," I said. "He replaced that kitchen floor on his knees over a 4-day weekend. He planted an oak tree the year I was born and he measured my height on it every birthday." Pause. "You sold it in 32 days. Her eyes went glassy. Calculated emotion. I couldn't tell if it was real or performed and I had stopped caring which. "I'm not here to make a deal," I said. "My attorney will be in touch." I turned and walked back upstairs. Cassie was hovering at the top with wide eyes. "What happened?" "Nothing," I said, picking up my phone and finally, hitting record on the voice memo app. Too late for this conversation. Not too late for the next one. 'Cause there would be a next one. Diane wasn't done. People like her were never done until every exit was blocked and every move exhausted. But here was the thing she still hadn't figured out. Neither was I. Todd Briggs had a 5-star rating on Zillow. 47 reviews. Phrases like professional, responsive made the process seamless. A headshot where he was smiling in front of a sold sign. Ironic given the circumstances. And a tagline that read, "Your home. Your future. My priority." I stared at his profile on my laptop for a long time that Saturday morning, drinking bad coffee at Cassie's kitchen table while the city of Millbrook woke up outside the window. Todd Briggs had listed my house in 8 days. He had a signed contract in 3 weeks. He had collected his commission, roughly $17,000, and moved on to his next listing without once verifying that the woman handing him the keys actually had the legal right to hand him anything. $17,000. For not asking one question. Pete had already filed the complaint with the Tennessee Real Estate Commission. But complaints move slowly. Bureaucracies move slowly. I had watched enough of this process in the past 2 weeks to understand that the official machinery of justice, while real and eventually effective, did not move at the speed of my anger. So I did something Pete hadn't told me to do. I called Todd Briggs myself. "This is Riley Calloway," I said when he picked up. "I'm the legal owner of 414 Sycamore Lane. The property you sold last month." Silence. Then, "I'm going to need to refer you to my broker." "You can do that," I said pleasantly. "Or you can talk to me for 5 minutes before this becomes a deposition." Another silence. Longer. "What do you want to know?" he asked. His voice had changed. The salesman warmth was gone. What was underneath it was something smaller and more honest. A man who had started to realize he had made a very expensive mistake. "Did she show you the will?" "Yes. She said she was the estate administrator." "Did you ask for documentation of that?" "Was. She had a death certificate and a letter." "From whom?" "It was on legal letterhead." "I assumed." "You assumed," I repeated. Not a question. Just the word sitting there between us on the line. Todd Briggs exhaled. It was the exhale of a man watching his Zillow rating circle the drain. "Look," he said quietly. "I should have pulled the probate records. I know that. I've known it since your uncle's office called me. He stopped. "She was very convincing." "She always is," I said. I hung up that I sat for a moment, then opened my laptop and started typing. Not a legal document, not an email to Pete. Personal account. Everything I knew, everything I had discovered, in my own words. Dated and time-stamped. Pete had told me documentation was everything. I was going to document all of it. What I didn't know yet was that Todd Briggs, rattled by my call and genuinely terrified of losing his real estate license, was about to do something that would crack the entire case wide open. He called his broker. His broker, a woman named Sandra Fitch who had been in Nashville real estate for 25 years and had approximately zero tolerance for liability, pulled every document from the Sycamore Lane transaction and called Pete's office by Monday morning. What Sandra found in that file changed everything. The letter Diane had presented, the one on legal letterhead suggesting she was the estate administrator, had not come from Gerald Puckett's office. It had not come from any attorney's office. The letterhead was fabricated. The signature was forged. And the notary stamp at the bottom, Sandra had checked, belonged to a notary in Brentwood, Tennessee whose license had expired 14 months earlier. Diane hadn't just misrepresented herself. She had forged documents. Pete called me Monday afternoon. I was in the parking lot of a Walgreens when my phone rang and his voice came through with that particular flatness he used when things were serious. "Riley," he said. "This just became a felony." I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up. People walked in and out of the Walgreens with their ordinary purchases. Paper towels, cold medicine, birthday cards. Normal life, moving at its normal pace. Completely unbothered by the fact that somewhere across town, a woman who had attended my father's funeral was about to be charged with forgery. I thought about my dad. He had trusted her. He had genuinely, completely trusted her. And I understood suddenly that getting the house back, as important as it was only part of this. The other part was making sure that what she had done to his memory, to his trust, to the one thing he had tried to give me, was named out loud. Publicly. Officially. Diane needed to be held accountable not just for what she had taken from me, but for what she had taken from him. The deposition was held on a Tuesday. Pete's conference room on the 14th floor of his Nashville office building had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Cumberland River. On any other day I might have found that beautiful. Today I barely noticed it. Diane arrived with her attorney, a man named Craig Whitfield who had the practiced confidence of someone who had gotten difficult people out of difficult situations before. He was good. I could tell immediately he was good. But he was working with bad material. And even the best carpenter can't build a solid table out of rotten wood. Diane was dressed conservatively. Dark blazer, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back. She looked like a woman performing remorse. And performing it competently. She didn't look at me when she walked in. I looked at her the entire time. Pete conducted the questioning. I sat beside him and said nothing, which was the hardest thing I had done in this entire process. Harder than finding the sold sign, harder than the confrontation outside Cassie's apartment, harder than listening to 22 voicemails. I am not a quiet person by nature. I am a person who processes things out loud, who asks questions, who pushes. Sitting in that room in silence while Pete methodically dismantled Diane's story was an exercise in restraint I will never forget. "Mrs. Calloway," Pete began. "It's Miss Harmon," Diane said, reverting to her maiden name. Another tell. She was already creating distance from my father's name. "Ms. Harmon," Pete said smoothly without missing a beat. When did you first contact Todd Briggs regarding the Sycamore Lane property? I don't recall the exact date. Would February 14th refresh your memory? Pete slid a document across the table. That's the date on the initial listing agreement bearing your signature. Was. If that's what the document says. It is. That's 11 days after Daniel Calloway's date of death. Were you aware at that time that the property had been left to Riley Calloway in the will? Craig Whitfield leaned forward. Objection to. This is a deposition, Craig, Pete said without looking at him. There's no objection. She can answer. Diane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I was aware there was a will. Were you aware of its contents? I had been informed generally. Specifically, Pete said. Had you been informed that 414 Sycamore Lane was bequeathed entirely to Riley and Calloway? The room was very quiet. I had some understanding of that, yes, Diane said carefully. I kept my face completely still. Some understanding. She had some understanding that the house was mine, and she listed it 11 days after my father died. Pete continued. He walked her through the fabricated letter, through the expired notary stamp, through the timeline she had constructed so carefully and which now, laid out document by document across a conference table, looked exactly like what it was. A premeditated plan executed during a window of legal vulnerability, while her stepdaughter was 5 hours away finishing a nursing degree and trying to survive her grief. By the time Pete reached the notary stamp, Craig Whitfield had stopped objecting. He was writing notes to himself with the focused energy of a man recalculating his strategy in real time. Diane's answers had become shorter, more careful, more lawyerly in a way that told me Craig had coached her extensively and she was now operating entirely from that coaching rather than from any genuine narrative. That was useful. Coached answers are consistent but brittle. Push at the edges and they crack. Pete pushed at the edges. Ms. Harmon, you stated earlier you had some understanding that the property belonged to Riley. Did you believe you had legal authority to sell it? Diane's answers had become shorter, more careful, more lawyerly in a way that told me Craig had coached her extensively and she was now operating entirely from that coaching rather than from any genuine narrative. That was useful. Coached answers are consistent but brittle. Push at the edges and they crack. Pete pushed at the edges. Ms. Harmon, you stated earlier you had some understanding that the property belonged to Riley. Did you believe you had legal authority to sell it? I'd like to take a break, Craig said. Of course, Pete said pleasantly. During the break I stepped into the hallway with Pete. He handed me a bottle of water and looked at me with something that might have been pride. She has no answer, he said quietly. There is no documentation because she fabricated it. And she knows that we know that. Craig knows it too, that's why he called the break. What happens now? Yes. Now. Pete took a sip of his own water. Now the DA's office gets the full deposition transcript. And Craig Whitfield starts negotiating. I looked out the window at the Cumberland River, gray and wide and moving steadily below us. Pete, I said. Is she going to prison? He was quiet for a moment. That depends on how cooperative she decides to be. And how creative Craig gets. He paused. But Riley, here's what I can tell you. The Holloways have agreed to a negotiated unwinding of the sale. The title company's insurance is going to cover their losses. And the house. He stopped. I turned to look at him. The house is coming back to you, he said. It's going to take some time. There's paperwork. There always is. But legally, technically on paper, it's already yours. I didn't cry in that hallway. I had promised myself I wouldn't cry about any of this until it was over. And it wasn't over yet. But I pressed my back against that wall on the 14th floor, and I closed my eyes, and for just a moment I let myself think about the oak tree. Still there, waiting, like I always knew it would be. The paperwork took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of title transfers and court filings and insurance negotiations and signatures on documents that I read every single word of, because I had learned the hard way what happens when people don't read what they're signing. 11 weeks of Pete's paralegal calling me with updates. I had to translate from legal language into human emotion just to understand how to feel about them. 11 weeks of driving past Sycamore Lane and looking at the oak tree over the fence and telling myself, soon. The Holloways, Marcus and Jenna, turned out to be decent people caught in a situation they never deserved. We spoke once, briefly, over the phone. Jenna cried a little. I almost did too. They had lost their down payment temporarily. Their renovation plans had been gutted, and their dream house had turned into a legal nightmare through absolutely no fault of their own. The title company's insurance covered their financial losses fully. Pete made sure of that. None of this was your fault, I told Jenna on the phone. None of it was yours either, she said. We left it there. Clean. Human. Diane took a plea. Craig Whitfield had spent 3 weeks negotiating with the DA's office, and in the end Diane pleaded guilty to 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation and 1 count of forgery of a legal document. She avoided prison. She was sentenced to 4 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and full financial restitution covering all legal fees and court costs associated with unwinding the fraudulent sale. She also lost something she hadn't anticipated losing. Family. My dad's sister, my Aunt Carol, had been quietly supportive throughout the whole process, texting me regularly, sending food to Cassie's apartment twice, showing up to sit beside me in Gerald's office one afternoon without being asked. When the plea was announced, Aunt Carol posted something on Facebook. Not dramatic, not long. Just a simple statement of facts, what had happened, what the outcome was, and a single line at the end that read, Daniel would have been heartbroken. Riley, we are proud of you. 43 family members and family friends liked it within the first hour. Diane's carefully curated social circle, the church potluck crowd, the neighborhood committee, the women who had hugged her at my father's funeral, went very quiet. Not all at once. Gradually. The way people distance themselves when the truth makes proximity uncomfortable. I did not feel good about that exactly. But I did not feel bad about it either. The morning I got my key back was a Thursday in early fall. Pete had offered to make it an event, to have someone meet me there to mark the occasion in some official way. Said no. This was not a moment for an audience. Some things need to happen in private, between a person and the place that matters to them, without anyone watching. I drove to Sycamore Lane alone. I parked in front of the green gate, repainted now, slightly different shade, but still green, and I sat in the car for a moment with the key in my hand. It was a standard house key. Nothing remarkable about it. Just metal, machine-cut, ordinary. IT was the most important object I had ever held. I got out of the car. The morning was cool and the oak tree in the backyard had started turning, edges of the leaves going gold and rust the way Tennessee trees do in September, dramatic and unhurried and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the months since I had last stood on this sidewalk. I walked up to the front door, put the key in the lock, turned it. The door swung open and the smell hit me immediately. Different now, the house had been empty for weeks, but underneath the emptiness there was something older and more permanent. The ghost of black coffee. The particular wood and thyme smell of a house that had been loved for 20 years by the same pair of hands. My dad. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I walked in. I walked through every room slowly. The kitchen where he had made pancakes every Sunday without fail. The hallway where he had measured my height in pencil marks on the doorframe. Still there, I checked immediately, and something cracked open in my chest when I saw them. The living room where we had watched football and argued about teams and fallen asleep on opposite ends of the couch. The back porch where he had sat every evening with his coffee and watched the yard go dark. I sat on that porch for a long time. The oak tree stood at the far end of the yard, thick and rooted and permanent. 24 years old. Planted by a man who had understood, even then, that the things worth having are the things that take time to grow. I thought about everything it had taken to be sitting in this chair. The sold sign. Gerald's office. Pete's phone calls. The deposition. The 11 weeks of paperwork. The 22 voicemails I had never returned. The Friday night on a sidewalk when I had looked Diane in the eye and said, "My attorney will be in touch." I thought about the girl who had driven back to Millbrook with a U-Haul trailer and a plan, and found a sold sign instead. I thought about who she had been that morning, and who she was now. Because here is what nobody tells you about fighting for something that belongs to you. It changes you. Not in the dramatic, cinematic way that stories sometimes suggest. Not a transformation with a clear before and after. Something quieter than that. A kind of solidifying. A settling into yourself that happens when you discover, through actual evidence, that you are harder to break than you thought. I had been a grieving girl when this started. I was still grieving. But I was also something else now. Something my father had always believed I was, even in the years when I hadn't believed it myself. I was someone who did not let go of what was hers. Pulled out my phone. I had one thing left to do. I opened my contacts, scrolled past Pete, past Gerald, past Cassie, and found a name I had been saving for this exact moment. A journalist. A woman named Dana Cho who wrote for the Nashville Tennessean and covered consumer fraud and property crime. We had connected through a mutual friend 3 weeks into the legal process, and I had told her then, "When it's over, I'll talk." It was over. Pressed call. Dana picked up on the second ring. "Riley," she said. "Is it done?" "I'm sitting on my back porch," I said. "Looking at my oak tree." Beat of silence. Then, "Can I come tomorrow?" "Yeah," I said. "Come tomorrow." Hung up. I sat there until the sun started dropping behind the tree line, turning the yard gold and long-shadowed and quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car passed on Sycamore Lane. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary Thursday evening. All of it, the cracked porch railing, the pencil marks on the doorframe, the oak tree, the smell of old wood and coffee and time, mine. Not because I was lucky. Not because the system worked perfectly or justice moved quickly or people did the right thing without being forced to. But because I had stood on a sidewalk in front of a sold sign and made a decision. I had decided not to be quiet. And my father, Daniel Calloway, a man who built things with his hands and planted trees for the long future and left the only thing that truly mattered to the only person who truly mattered, would have been proud. I was sure of it. I was finally, completely sure of it. She found a sold sign on her own inherited house, and still won. If Riley's story had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe for more stories that hit different. New chapter drops every day. Don't miss it.